The champagne flute in my hand had gone warm, and Audrey Knox was smiling at me the way she used to smile right before she introduced me to someone as a friend who helps with parties. "June," she said, tilting her head, that same practiced softness in her voice. "You look wonderful. Working tonight, or just here?" "Both, obviously." I was standing in the middle of the ballroom I had spent 6 weeks designing, underneath 400 hand-wired candles, suspended on nearly invisible wire, surrounded by white orchids I had personally steamed the wrinkles out of that afternoon, wearing an earpiece that connected me to my 2 exhausted assistants stationed by the kitchen doors. But I understood the real question. She wanted to know if I had anyone. She wanted to know if, 18 months after she'd let me go, the way you let go of a library book you forgot you'd borrowed, I was still alone in the exact shape she'd left me. "Working," I said. "It's a beautiful event, isn't it?" "You always did have an eye," she said, and there it was, the compliment with the door held open behind it, waiting for her to walk through and remind me of everything else. Celia and I were just admiring the flowers. "Have you met Celia? My fiancé." She said fiancé like she was setting a diamond down on velvet. Celia Ward extended a hand efficient enough to belong to a woman who ran a hostile takeover before breakfast. "Laurent House Board," she said, as if that explained her, which, in this room, it did. I knew who she was. I had spent 3 months getting security clearances and vendor approvals that all somehow ran, eventually, through committees she sat on. "Congratulations," I told them both, and meant it, mostly. In the specific way you mean something you have decided not to let hurt you anymore. It was Audrey's friend Priya who asked the question that broke the floor out from under me. She'd had 2 glasses of the good champagne, and none of Audrey's tact. "June, did you come with someone tonight, or are you working solo as usual?" Solo as usual, like it was a diagnosis. I felt the old panic rising, quick and hot. The particular flavor of humiliation that only comes from being seen exactly as someone predicted you'd be seen. Audrey's eyes had that flicker of satisfaction she used to get when she'd successfully made me small enough to fit back inside the version of me she preferred. Talented, useful, conveniently unattached, no threat to anyone's photographs. "Actually," I said, and my mouth kept moving before my brain caught up to it, the way it does sometimes when you are cornered, and would rather combust than confirm what someone already believes about you. "I did come with someone." "Oh?" Audrey's eyebrows rose, delighted. "Who?" I don't know what made me look across the ballroom at exactly that second. Maybe it was luck. Maybe some instinct for self-destruction. Sabine Laurent was standing near the north windows in a black suit so precisely cut it looked less like clothing and more like architecture, talking to 2 board members with the flat, unreadable calm that had earned her the name I'd heard whispered by 3 different vendors that week, the Winter Queen. She was not someone anyone claimed casually. She was not someone anyone claimed at all. "Sabine," I said. "Sabine Laurent." The silence that followed had a texture to it, something you could have cut and served on one of my own trays. "Sabine Laurent," Audrey repeated, very carefully, like she was checking the words for a hidden trapdoor. "The CEO." "Yes." "You're dating the CEO of Laurent House." "Yes," I said, in the tone of a woman who had just signed her own death certificate and was choosing, for reasons unknown even to herself, to date it beautifully. Audrey's mouth curved into something that wanted to be sympathy and was actually anticipation. She thought she had caught me in it already. She half-turned, scanning for Sabine, probably already composing the story she'd tell at brunch on Sunday. I watched my entire professional future prepare to end in a ballroom full of people who mattered. And then Sabine Laurent was walking toward us. She moved the way water moves when it has decided exactly where it's going. No hurry, no wasted motion, the crowd parting slightly around her without seeming to notice it was doing so. I had time to think, distantly, that I was about to be publicly and correctly humiliated by the most powerful woman in the room, and that at least the flowers had turned out well. She didn't look at Audrey. She didn't look at Celia. She looked at me, read something in my face in about half a second. The wide eyes, the held breath, the fear underneath the smile I'd frozen into place. and something in her own expression shifted, subtle as a change in light. Her arm came around my waist, firm, certain. Her palm settled at my hip like it had done it 100 times before, and she pulled me back against her, close enough that I could smell cedar and amber, and something warmer underneath, and she said, in a voice low enough to feel like it belonged only to us, and just loud enough for Audrey to hear every word. "You promised me we were keeping this private tonight." I could not have spoken if my life depended on it, which, professionally, it currently did. Sabine tipped her head down and pressed her lips, very briefly, to my temple. Then she looked at Audrey with an expression of mild, aristocratic curiosity, the kind you might give a stranger who had wandered into the wrong conversation. "I don't believe we've met." "Audrey Knox," Audrey said, and for the first time in the 2 years I had known her, I heard her voice lose its footing. "Sabine," Sabine said. "Unnecessary, since everyone in the tri-state hospitality industry knew exactly who she was, but it landed like a door closing." Her hand tightened, just slightly at my waist. Not a warning, I would understand much later, but something closer to solidarity. One woman recognizing exactly what kind of ambush the other had just survived. "If you'll excuse us." June promised me a look at the greenhouse installation before the toasts. There was no greenhouse installation. There was, in fact, no greenhouse in this building at all. But I let her walk me away from Audrey's stunned face and Celia's rapidly calculating one, my heart going so hard I thought the whole room could probably hear it over the string quartet. And I did not say a single word until we were around the corner by the coat check, where a photographer for the City Society page had apparently been standing the entire time, because the flash went off twice before either of us noticed him, capturing Sabine's hand still curved possessively at my hip, and my stunned, guilty face tipped up toward hers. "Miss Laurent?" he said, delighted, already backing away to file it. "Miss Laurent, is this?" "Good evening," Sabine said, which was not a confirmation, and somehow was one anyway, and steered me firmly toward the service corridor before he could ask anything else. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. The corridor smelled like polished brass and warm candle wax drifting in from the ballroom, and Sabine didn't let go of my hand until we reached a private elevator tucked behind an unmarked panel, the kind of door you'd never notice unless you already knew hotels the way she did. She pressed her palm to a sensor, and the doors slid open onto dark wood paneling and a small brass panel with exactly 2 buttons. "In," she said. I went in. What else was I going to do? Refuse the woman who had just saved my entire career from Audrey Knox's teeth? The doors closed. The elevator didn't move. For a long moment, Sabine simply looked at me, arms loosely crossed, her expression unreadable in the low gold light, and I became excruciatingly aware that I was about to be fired from the best contract of my life by a woman who had, 90 seconds ago, kissed my temple in front of witnesses. "I should explain," I started. "You should," she agreed. "But first I'd like to know why me." The honest answer came out before I could dress it up. "Because you were the only person in that room she'd actually believe." Something flickered at the corner of Sabine's mouth. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one deciding whether it was safe to exist. I'm not certain if that's a compliment or an insult. It's not an insult. Everyone's terrified of you. If I'd said I was dating literally anyone else in that ballroom, Audrey would have had it disproven by dessert. But you, I exhaled. Nobody argues with you. People argue with me constantly, Sabine said. They simply lose. She studied me for another moment, and whatever she saw made the sharp edge of her come down half a degree. I'm not angry, June. I want that understood, before you talk yourself into an apology I don't need. You're not? I recognized the look on your face before you said my name, she said, quieter now. I've worn it myself. Someone deciding, in real time, whether it would be worse to be exposed or to lie. I wasn't going to let you stand there alone in it. She pressed the button at last, and the elevator began its slow, humming climb. That doesn't mean this isn't a problem. There was a photographer. It will be everywhere by morning. I'll fix it, I said. I'll tell people it was a joke. You'll do nothing tonight, Sabine said, in the tone of a woman ending a negotiation. We'll decide what to do with clearer heads. Not tonight, and not in a hotel corridor at 11:45. The elevator opened onto a private landing. Go home, June, sleep. I imagine tomorrow will be complicated enough without you starting it exhausted. I went home. I did not sleep, and in the morning, complicated turned out to be an understatement of historic proportions. By 9 a.m., Mila had already sent me 11 texts. A screenshot of the Society photographer's post, Sabine Laurent, notoriously private CEO of Laurent House, spotted in an intimate embrace with an unidentified woman at last night's Beacon Charity Gala, and a voice memo that was mostly her laughing so hard she couldn't finish a sentence. You, she said, when I finally called her back, breathless, have never once in the 3 years I've known you brought home so much as a phone number, and now you're apparently dating a hotel empire. It's not real, I said, pacing my studio, stepping over a half-finished centerpiece of white ranunculus I'd abandoned mid-wire the night before. I panicked. Audrey cornered me, and I panicked, and I said the first name that came into my head, and it happened to be the most powerful woman in the city, and now there's a photograph. There is a photograph, Mila agreed, entirely too delighted, of Sabine Laurent's hand on your hip, like she's been doing it for years. June, she kissed your temple. The Winter Queen does not do PDA. I've heard she once ended a merger because a man tried to hug her. I know. So what happens now? I did not get to answer, because at that exact moment the bell over my studio door rang, and Sabine Laurent walked in, wearing a charcoal coat over yesterday's exhaustion, looking entirely, spectacularly out of place among my ribbon spools, drying flowers, and the 6 half-built centerpieces currently drying on every flat surface I owned. Oh my God, Mila whispered into the phone, and hung up on me without saying goodbye. I should have called, Sabine said, glancing around at the organized chaos of my studio like she'd wandered onto the surface of an unfamiliar planet. Candle wax on the work table, ribbon looped over a ladder, 3 coffee cups in varying states of abandonment, fabric swatches pinned to a corkboard in a color-coded rainbow. Only I understood. I wasn't certain you'd answer, so I came instead. You could have summoned me to your office, I said. Isn't that generally how this works? The CEO calls, the vendor appears. I didn't want you to feel summoned. She picked up a spool of ivory ribbon, turned it over once in her fingers, set it back down with the exact precision of someone unused to touching things that weren't hers to control. I wanted to see where you actually work. Well, now you know. It's chaos with good lighting. It suits you, she said, and it did not sound like flattery. It sounded like an observation she'd made and filed away before she'd decided to say it out loud. She wandered further in while I stood there, trying to remember how to breathe like a normal person. She paused at the corkboard, where I'd pinned swatches of ivory silk beside a photograph of the Beacon ballroom, mid-installation, ladders and cable, and half-strung candles everywhere, nothing yet in its place. This was 2 hours before doors opened, I said, following her gaze. It looked like a disaster. Nobody who walked in that night would have believed it. I find that reassuring, Sabine said. Most of what I oversee looks like a disaster, for considerably longer than 2 hours before anyone notices improvement. Is that an insult to my industry or a confession about yours? Both, she said, and there was that same flicker again, gone before I could be sure I'd seen it. She reached out and touched, very briefly, the edge of a half-finished centerpiece, ranunculus and trailing ivy wired into a shape I hadn't finished yet, with the careful, hesitant curiosity of someone unused to touching things she couldn't immediately categorize or price. You built all of this from nothing. 4 years ago, I was doing centerpieces for other people's studios and taking whatever jobs paid on time. Now I do this. I gestured at the chaos around us, oddly proud of it in that moment, the way you're proud of a mess that is entirely, unmistakably yours. It's not glamorous most days. It's ribbon and glue guns and yelling at delivery trucks. It's yours, Sabine said simply, like that settled the matter. And something about the plainness of it, no embellishment, no performance, undid a knot in my chest I hadn't realized was still tied. Then, business again. The photograph has been picked up by 2 industry newsletters and, as of this morning, one of the wider gossip accounts. Correcting it publicly would require explaining what actually happened, which would embarrass you professionally, in a room full of your own clients, and would hand Audrey Knox exactly the humiliation she was hunting for last night. So we let it stand, I said slowly, for now. That's not what I came to suggest, Sabine said. I came to offer to take responsibility myself. I'll say I overstepped, that I misread a friendly gesture, that the reporting was... No, I said, surprising us both. If you take the blame, it looks like you humiliated yourself defending a stranger, which is worse for you. And it still leaves me exactly where Audrey wants me, alone, and now also a punchline. I sat down on my stool, rubbing my eyes. What if we just let it be true, for a while, until the gossip dies down on its own? Sabine considered me the way she probably considered acquisitions. You understand what you're proposing. I'm proposing we keep pretending. Not forever, just until Audrey stops circling and this stops being interesting to anyone. There's a hotel reopening in 3 weeks, Sabine said. The coastal property, my grandmother's hotel. There will be board members, press, a vote on the international expansion I've spent 2 years building. Celia Ward would very much like a reason to say I've allowed my personal life to compromise my judgment. If we do this, and it unravels badly, it will unravel in front of exactly the people I can least afford to unravel in front of. Then we don't let it unravel badly. She studied me a long moment. 3 weeks, through the reopening. After that, we end it cleanly. On our own terms, and no one else's. Deal, I said, and put out my hand like we were closing a business arrangement, which, I told myself very firmly, was exactly what this was. Sabine looked at my hand, then shook it once, businesslike, her palm warm and dry against mine. A few conditions, she said. No surprise kisses. Nothing happens without asking first. You do not enter my home unless invited. I do not enter yours. Nothing either of us says in private becomes public currency. And either of us can end this at any moment. No explanation required. Agreed, I said. And, Sabine, I'm not going to let you pay me for this. I know how these stories usually go. I'm being paid for the reopening event, properly, on a contract I signed before any of this happened. That's the only money that changes hands. Something in her face eased, very slightly, like she'd been braced for me to ask for something and was relieved I hadn't. Understood. Our first rehearsal happened 4 days later, in an empty mirrored suite above one of Sabine's city hotels, ahead of a press breakfast meant to be our first real public appearance as a couple. Sabine stood across from me in shirt sleeves, tie loosened, looking more human than I'd ever seen her, and said, with the clipped seriousness of someone briefing a security team, "People will notice if we stand like strangers. We need to look natural. May I touch you?" "You may." Her hand found my waist, light, testing. "Better," she murmured, though I wasn't sure what she was comparing it to. "Adjust my collar." "What?" "It's the kind of thing a girlfriend does without thinking. Adjust my collar." I stepped close and reached up, fixing a perfectly straight collar that did not need fixing, and felt her breath change, almost imperceptibly, under my knuckles. "Look at me like no one else in the room exists," she said, quiet now, her voice dropping out of its rehearsal register into something else entirely. "That's difficult," I said, before I could stop myself, because when you look at someone like that, they kind of don't. For a moment, neither of us moved. Her hand tightened at my waist. I felt the pull of her, the specific gravity of a woman who did not do this, did not stand this close to anyone, did not let her breath catch for anyone. And I understood, distantly, that we were standing exactly 1 inch away from a mistake neither of us had agreed to. Sabine's eyes dropped to my mouth. Mine dropped to hers. Then she stepped back, businesslike again, clearing her throat. "That will do," she said, "for the cameras." We ran through it twice more, though I could not have told you afterward what the second run added that the first hadn't already accomplished. She taught me a private nickname to use in front of people. "Something ordinary," she said. Nothing anyone would suspect of being invented. And we settled on L's, a shortening of nothing in particular, just a sound that felt like it belonged only to us. I taught her, in turn, that she needed to laugh occasionally in public. Actually laugh, not the tight, closed-mouth smile she deployed for photographers. And she informed me, with total seriousness, that laughing on command was not a skill she possessed. Try, I said. Think of something funny. I don't find things funny on a schedule. That's the most CEO sentence I've ever heard a human say out loud. And she laughed, surprised out of her, quick and real. And I grinned at her like I'd won something. And for a second, the mirrored room held two people who had genuinely forgotten, for the length of that laugh, that any of this had started as a lie. At the breakfast, she was flawless. She remembered that I took my coffee with too much cream, though I'd only mentioned it once, in passing, days ago. She pulled out my chair before I could reach it myself. When a smear of powdered sugar landed on my lower lip from the pastry the hotel had, of course, catered to perfection, she reached over and brushed it away with her thumb, so naturally that the reporter across the table simply smiled and moved on to her next question, never suspecting that Sabine's thumb had lingered half a second longer than the gesture required. When Audrey appeared, because of course she appeared, drawn like a moth to any room where I might be visibly winning, she tried the old trick, introducing herself to the reporter as an old friend of June's, the kind of phrase designed to remind me that I'd once been someone's secret. June Ellery, Sabine said, before the reporter could ask anything further, is the event designer responsible for last month's Beacon Gala and the woman currently redesigning our coastal reopening from the ground up. She built her studio from nothing in 4 years. She said it like a fact sheet, not an introduction, and it landed harder than any declaration of love could have, because Audrey had spent 2 years never once saying my name out loud in a room that mattered. I did real work in the weeks that followed, because pretending to date the most feared executive in the city did not, unfortunately, pause my actual job. I redesigned lighting sequences at midnight, fired a subcontractor who tried to substitute cheaper linens without telling me, and stood between 2 junior staffers and an executive who wanted to blame them for a delivery delay that was, provably, his own department's fault. They didn't authorize the vendor swap, I told the executive, a man named Prescott who ran logistics for the coastal property and clearly resented answering to anyone who arrived in ribbon-covered flats instead of a suit. Your procurement office did, 3 weeks ago, in an email I can forward you right now if you'd like to keep insisting otherwise. Ms. Ellery, this isn't. It is exactly my business, since it's my installation that will look wrong on opening night if we don't fix it today. And it's my 2 assistants you're currently trying to blame for your department's paperwork. I kept my voice level, professional, the way I'd learned to keep it in rooms exactly like this one, long before Sabine Laurent ever existed in my life. Fix the order, I'll fix the seating. He fixed the order. Word of the exchange apparently reached Sabine within the hour, because that evening she mentioned it, dry and almost amused, over a dinner neither of us had planned to share. Prescott called you formidable, she said. From him, that's practically a marriage proposal. I'll take it under advisement. He also complained that you made him feel unqualified for his own job. Was I wrong? No, Sabine admitted, which is precisely why he's complaining. She looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. I don't often see people manage my staff better than my staff manage themselves. Sabine started appearing at odd hours, not to check on me, she insisted, simply to review logistics, and I began to notice the cost of her position up close. The calls that came at midnight, the meals she skipped, the exhaustion she refused to let show in front of anyone but, apparently, me. I watched her take a call at 10 at night from a board member in a different time zone, her voice never once losing its flat, controlled register even as her free hand pressed hard against her temple. And I understood, watching her, that the version of Sabine the industry feared, and the version currently rubbing her own eyes raw from 3 hours of sleep, were the same exhausted woman wearing 2 different masks, depending on who was in the room. One night, past 1 in the morning, I found her alone at a table in the empty grand ballroom, laptop open, 3 different documents stacked beside her, a single cold cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched in hours. I'd been testing lighting cues from the catwalk above and came down when I noticed she hadn't moved in 40 minutes. "You haven't eaten," I said, setting a container of noodles from the all-night place 2 blocks over down in front of her. "I'm fine." "You're not going to survive a hostile board vote on caffeine and willpower. Eat." She looked at the noodles, then at me, with the particular irritation of someone unused to being told what to do by anyone below her own pay grade. Then, to my genuine surprise, she picked up the fork. "This is insubordination," she said dryly, and I laughed, and something in her face changed at the sound of it. Surprised, almost pleased, like she hadn't expected to make me laugh either. We talked for an hour after that about nothing important. She had, it turned out, a dry, unexpected sense of humor she deployed so rarely, I understood immediately why almost no one at Laurent House had ever seen it. It was the first time I heard her laugh, a short, startled sound, like she'd forgotten she still had it in her, and I filed the sound away somewhere I didn't examine too closely. Our second public appearance was the reopening of a restored historic theater Laurent House had sponsored. I wore green silk I could not entirely afford and felt, walking in on Sabine's arm past donors with 3 times my net worth stitched into their jewelry, exactly as insecure as I'd been afraid I would. Sabine noticed. She always noticed. She reached over and straightened the clasp of my necklace, unnecessary, and said quietly, "No one in that room created anything tonight. You did. Let them be impressed." We danced because the photographers expected it, her hand settling at the small of my back the way it had 100 times by now for cameras. Except this time her breathing changed, and mine did too, and somewhere in the second turn around the floor, we both stopped performing and started, simply, dancing. When the song ended, neither of us stepped back right away. "You're good at this," I murmured, still close enough that only she could hear it. "At dancing?" "At all of it. Making people believe things." Something crossed her face, quick and unreadable. "I used to be better at it than I am tonight," she said, and didn't explain what she meant, and I didn't ask, though I turned the sentence over in my head for the rest of the evening, trying to decide whether it had been a warning or a confession. Audrey found me by the coat check afterward. No audience this time. Her voice dropped into the register she used only when she wanted something. "Are you sure she's not just using you?" she asked. "Do you understand what women like her do to people like us?" I didn't answer that one. I should have told Sabine about the messages that started after. The increasingly personal ones, Audrey circling old memories, implying I still belonged to her in some private ledger neither of us had closed. But I didn't, because admitting I was still hearing from her felt like admitting I hadn't fully let go, and I didn't want Sabine to look at me and see someone still tethered to her past. That silence would cost me later. I didn't know that yet. 3 days before the coastal reopening, we flew out together. A business necessity, Sabine insisted, since I needed to walk the property before final installation. The hotel sat on a cliff above a gray, restless ocean, all glass corridors and covered furniture, and old brass elevators that still smelled faintly of salt and dust. It had belonged to Sabine's grandmother, she told me on the drive up, before it became simply an asset on a balance sheet. She'd spent childhood summers there. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped slightly the moment we walked through the doors. Not relief, exactly, but recognition. The particular ache of returning somewhere that used to be a home and had since become a job. The first night, before the storm broke, Sabine walked me through the property herself, rather than handing me off to a manager, past long glass corridors filmed with salt from decades of ocean wind, past furniture still shrouded in white sheets in the unused east wing, past an old brass elevator that groaned when it moved, and smelled faintly of the sea no matter how many times it had been serviced. "My grandmother used to let me run the length of that corridor barefoot," she said, nodding toward the glass hallway overlooking the cliffs, until my mother decided it wasn't appropriate for a Laurent to be seen running anywhere. She said it lightly, but I heard the small, old grief underneath it, the particular loss of a child who'd had a home turned, piece by piece, into an asset. A storm hit 2 nights before the event, cutting power in the east wing, and collapsing part of the outdoor pavilion we'd built for the ceremony. Rain came in sideways off the cliffs hard enough to rattle the old windows, and for a while, the entire hotel ran on backup generators and flashlight beams bobbing through the dark corridors. I expected Sabine to disappear into calls and directives, barking logistics from some warm, dry office, while everyone else got wet. Instead, I found her in the staff hallway at 2 in the morning, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair damp, carrying boxes of emergency candles alongside 2 junior staffers, checking that everyone had blankets and dry clothes, giving her own coat without ceremony to a shivering 19-year-old who'd been soaked running cable in the rain. "Ms. Laurent, you don't have to," the girl started. "I'm aware," Sabine said, already moving on to the next box, "that I don't have to. Put it on before you catch something. I'd rather not explain to your mother why you're ill." I stood in the doorway for a moment just watching her, this woman the industry called cold, methodically making sure 24 exhausted staff members had dry socks and hot coffee before she'd let herself so much as sit down. She caught me watching, and something almost sheepish crossed her face, like she'd been caught doing something she considered private. "Don't," she warned before I could say anything. I wasn't going to say anything. "You were going to say something about the Winter Queen handing out blankets." "I was going to say," I said, "that I understand now why your staff would follow you into a hurricane." That landed somewhere she clearly hadn't braced for, and she looked away first, busying herself with a box that didn't need rearranging. I redesigned the entire ceremony layout on the spot, moving it indoors, sketching new sightlines on the back of a room service menu by flashlight, while 2 of my assistants relayed measurements over a crackling radio. Sabine watched me do it, calm, fast, unbothered, rerouting an entire evening's plan in under an hour without raising my voice once, with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something closer to admiration than approval, the look of someone recalibrating exactly how much she'd underestimated another person's competence. It was during that storm that I found the greenhouse, a huge, neglected structure of glass and rusted iron behind the east wing, half its panes cracked, vines growing wild through the gaps, but beautiful in the way abandoned, once-loved things are beautiful. I suggested, over her initial and immediate refusal, that we use it for the reopening ceremony instead of the ballroom. "No," Sabine said. "Too fast, too flat. Not that space." I didn't push, but 2 nights later, unprompted, she brought me there herself, in the rain, the glass roof drumming steadily above us, and told me why. Her former partner, the only serious relationship she'd allowed herself in years, used to meet her in a greenhouse just like this one, back before the woman had collected every private letter, every unguarded message, and released them during their breakup to make Sabine look unstable, obsessive, easy to discard in the press. "I decided after that," Sabine said, voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, "that no one would ever again have enough of the truth of me to hurt me with it. And now, I've made you perform a relationship in front of an entire industry," I said. "I did to you the exact thing you were protecting yourself from." "You did," she agreed. "That should frighten me more than it does." Her eyes found mine, unguarded in a way I understood now she almost never allowed. "The frightening part isn't the performance anymore, June. The frightening part is that being close to you has stopped feeling false." She reached up and touched my jaw, thumb tracing along it slow enough to be a question. "Tell me to stop performing." "I don't think you are," I said. "Do you want me to stop?" "No." The kiss started slow, her hand at my waist, mine curled into the front of her coat, rain hammering the glass above us like it was trying to get in. And then it wasn't slow at all. Weeks of rehearsed touches breaking open into something neither of us had scripted, her mouth warm and certain against mine, my back against cold glass, both of us breathing like we'd been running. We stopped before it went further than a first kiss should, both of us shaking slightly, because neither of us wanted whatever this was becoming to get tangled up with what had started as a lie. "That was not part of the arrangement," Sabine said, a little breathless. A little wrecked in a way I found I liked far too much. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." She rested her forehead briefly against mine, both of us still catching our breath, rain hammering the glass roof above us in a rhythm that felt, absurdly, like applause. I don't know how to do this slowly, she admitted, quiet, almost embarrassed by the admission. I've spent years making sure I never wanted anything I couldn't fully control. I don't know how to want something and simply let it happen at its own pace. We could learn together, I offered. I'm not exactly an expert either. My last relationship taught me that wanting something in the open is apparently a character flaw. It isn't, Sabine said, immediate and certain, in a voice that left no room for argument. Whatever she taught you, June, unlearn it. Wanting things visibly is not a weakness. I've simply never had anyone worth the risk of being seen wanting. We stood there a while longer under the drumming rain, her hand still resting warm against my jaw, neither of us in any hurry to be the one who stepped back first. Because of the storm, we ended up in adjoining rooms rather than separate wings, and the days that followed gave me a version of Sabine Laurent nobody outside that hotel had ever seen. I dried her hair with a towel after she came in soaked from checking on the pavilion repairs. She made tea so bad I nearly cried laughing, an astonishing failure from a woman who was otherwise unnervingly good at everything she attempted. We ate leftover pastry standing barefoot in the hotel kitchen at midnight. I fell asleep once against her shoulder while reviewing seating charts, and woke to find she hadn't moved, a blanket tucked around me, her own eyes tired but open, watching the door like she was still on duty even in her exhaustion. One night I woke from a dream about Audrey, one of the old ones, the kind where she introduces me as a friend to a room full of faces I recognize and I can't make my mouth form my own name, and found Sabine's hand resting near mine on the mattress between our room's shared threshold. Not touching, just close, like she'd left it there deliberately in case I needed it. "You were talking in your sleep," she said quietly, when she realized I was awake. "I didn't want to wake you. May I hold your hand?" "You're asking permission to hold my hand at 3 a.m. I told you I'd ask before things happened. I intend to keep that promise even for small things." Her fingers laced through mine, warm and steady, and I fell back asleep faster than I had in months, anchored by nothing more than that. Sabine's younger cousin Elise arrived 2 days later with her 8-year-old daughter, both of them there for the reopening, and I watched something in Sabine soften entirely out of its corporate shape. Elise told me, when Sabine had stepped out, that Sabine had quietly paid for her education years ago, had shown up without being asked during Elise's divorce, visited her niece whenever her schedule allowed, which, Elise said, smiling, was rarer than either of them liked. I found Sabine an hour later, sitting perfectly still, while her niece braided one section of her otherwise flawless hair, and covered the corner of an expensive leather notebook in unicorn stickers without complaint. "The Winter Queen has a serious image problem," I told her later, grinning. "You," Sabine said, entirely deadpan, "are becoming a threat to national security." At a pre-opening cocktail reception the following evening, a visiting architect, charming, confident, clearly interested, spent 20 minutes talking to me about lighting design and touched my arm twice in the process. I was polite. I did nothing to encourage it, but I watched Sabine watch it happen from across the room, her jaw tightening in a way that had nothing to do with performance, and when the architect's hand landed on my arm a second time, Sabine crossed the room in 4 unhurried strides, slid her arm around my waist, and drew me firmly against her side. To the room, it looked exactly like all our other rehearsed gestures. To me, it felt like something entirely different, instinctive, unmeasured, nothing like the careful choreography we'd practiced in that mirrored suite. Later, in the private corridor outside our rooms, I asked her about it. "Was that part of the performance?" "No," Sabine said, without hesitation, which surprised us both. "I didn't like watching her touch you. I have no logical claim to that reaction, given what this is supposed to be, and I don't care." "What is this supposed to be?" I asked quietly. "I don't know anymore," she admitted, and something in her voice, the rawness of a controlled woman losing her grip on the story she'd been telling herself, undid me completely. I reached for her first this time. The kiss that followed was more urgent than the greenhouse had been, less careful, both of us finally admitting what 3 weeks of rehearsed touches had actually been rehearsing us for. I won't describe everything that happened after we made it back to her room, only that it was slow and deliberate in a way that had nothing left to do with performance. her hands sure and unhurried at the buttons of my dress, my fingers working the tie she'd left loosened all evening, whispered permission traded back and forth between us like something sacred, her mouth against my throat, my name in her voice sounding entirely unlike the careful, controlled way she said everything else. What passed between us that night stayed between us, exactly as we'd promised each other it would. And when I woke, I was wearing her shirt, and she was already awake beside me, watching me with an expression I hadn't yet learned the name for. She made coffee. Badly, again, but I didn't say so. For one unguarded hour, we were simply two women in a kitchen, and neither of us mentioned the reopening, the board, or the lie that had brought us here, until her phone buzzed and reality walked back into the room without knocking. Celia Ward had obtained screenshots of Audrey's messages, the ones I'd hidden, the increasingly personal ones asking whether Sabine was using me, whether I remembered what we used to have, and released them selectively to a business gossip account, framed to suggest I'd remained emotionally entangled with my ex while publicly dating Sabine. Worse, Celia was quietly suggesting to board members that I'd been awarded the coastal reopening contract because of my personal relationship with the CEO, not despite it. Sabine wanted to deploy Laurent House's legal team immediately, aggressively, the way she deployed every resource when something she valued was under threat. I refused to be defended into invisibility. I don't need you to make me disappear until the scandal is over, I told her, my voice shaking with something closer to anger than fear. I need you to stand beside me while I speak. Protecting you means removing the danger, Sabine said, already reaching for her phone. Protecting me without my choice is just another way of erasing me, I said, and watched that land somewhere it clearly hadn't been meant to. I'm trying to keep this from destroying you, Sabine said, her voice tightening the way it did when she felt a situation slipping out of her grip. I have resources. Lawyers, a press team who can bury this by tomorrow morning. I don't want it buried, Sabine. I want it answered. There's a difference. You bury things you're afraid people will believe. I'd rather stand there and prove them wrong. I pressed my palms flat against the cool marble of the console table between us, trying to steady myself. You keep trying to solve me like I'm a logistics problem. I'm not something that needs managing. I need you to trust that I can defend my own name. I don't know how to do it the way you're asking, Sabine admitted, quieter now, some of the polish cracking. Every instinct I have says remove the danger before it reaches you. That's how I've survived every version of this that's happened to me before. I know, I said, gentler now, but I'm not her. Whoever hurt you before, I'm not going to disappear the second things get difficult, and I need you to stop treating my choices like a threat you have to manage around. She didn't answer that, not fully, and the silence that followed felt like the first crack in something we hadn't yet admitted was fragile. It was Audrey, of all people, who broke whatever fragile trust remained. She asked to meet me privately at the greenhouse the next afternoon, and, foolishly, hoping to finally close the door for good, I went. She told me Sabine would choose the company over me eventually, that she'd only gotten engaged to Celia because my love had felt too ordinary for the future she wanted, then tried to soften it by claiming she'd always loved me in her own way. You don't miss loving me, I told her, finally understanding it clearly enough to say out loud. You miss having access to me. I left her standing there, but Sabine had received a photograph, manipulated, cropped to remove context, of Audrey's hand on my arm in that greenhouse, and instead of asking me what had happened, her old wound did what old wounds do. It closed her off entirely. By the time I found her, she was formal again, distant in a way I hadn't seen since our very first conversation in that private elevator, and she offered, in the calm, business-like voice she used for closing failing negotiations, to end our arrangement early, to protect my reputation before things got worse. Being dismissed politely, I told her, my voice breaking despite my best effort to keep it steady, still feels like being abandoned, Sabine. She didn't answer. I left the coastal hotel the next morning, before the reopening, though I didn't abandon the work. Every lighting cue, every floral installation, every seating chart stayed in motion through my team, while I directed it from my studio, 300 miles and one very large silence away. The days that followed were quietly unbearable, in ways neither of us, I found out later, ever admitted to the other directly. I found one of Sabine's cufflinks under a fabric sample in my studio and could not throw it away. The flowers I'd set aside for her private table wilted, untouched, on my work table, and I couldn't bring myself to compost them. Sabine, I learned much later, reached for a second coffee cup out of habit 3 mornings running, before remembering there was no one there to hand it to, and listened to a voice message I'd left her. Just my voice. No real words. An apology I hadn't finished. 4 times without ever answering it. I threw myself into work the way I always had, the one reliable thing that had never once abandoned me. I finished the final lighting plots for the reopening at my own studio desk, forwarded every note to my team on the ground at the coast, and told myself, unconvincingly, that this was simply how the arrangement had always been destined to end. Cleanly, on schedule, exactly as we'd agreed in that first businesslike handshake. It did not feel clean. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and removed something I hadn't realized I'd started depending on. Mila showed up at my studio 4 days in, took one look at the flowers wilting untouched on my work table and the half-eaten dinners in my trash can, and sat down cross-legged on my floor without asking permission. "Okay," she said. "Talk." "There's nothing to talk about. It was always supposed to end." "June," she said my name the way she'd said it 100 times before, the tone she used when she could see straight through whatever performance I was currently attempting. "You have wilted flowers on your desk that you clearly can't bring yourself to throw away, and you've been wearing the same cardigan for 3 days, which even for you is a lot." I didn't say anything for a long moment. "I don't know if she'll ever actually let me in," I finally admitted. "Not just the arrangement. Her, actually her." Mila did not tell me simply to forgive her. "Her fear explains what she did," she said, sitting on my studio floor amid ribbon scraps. "It doesn't excuse the silence." Then, because Mila had never once let me off easy, she added, "But you hid Audrey's messages from her too, and then you were angry she didn't trust something she wasn't allowed to see. You don't get to only ask for honesty going one direction." I sat with that for a long time after she left. It was true, and it was uncomfortable, and it was exactly the kind of thing only Mila would ever say to my face. I didn't know if Sabine would choose me. I decided to go to the reopening anyway, finish the work I'd started, and tell the truth publicly if it came to that, because I was done being someone who disappeared quietly to keep the peace. The Coastal Hotel reopened on a clear night, the storm long gone, the greenhouse I'd restored glowing with suspended lights and climbing white flowers, candles doubled in the old glass, the ocean visible and black beyond the cliffs. It was, without question, the best work I had ever done. Celia had timed her move for exactly this evening, using the assembled board and press to suggest that Sabine's judgment had become compromised by personal impulse, that the contract I'd been awarded proved it. A reporter asked, loudly enough for half the room to hear, whether I had manipulated my way into both the CEO's bed and her business. I stepped forward before Sabine could speak for me. I felt her hand twitch at her side, the old instinct to shield me from exactly this kind of exposure, and I gave her the smallest shake of my head. "Let me." I told them the truth, all of it, that the relationship had started as a lie, an impulsive claim made in a moment of public humiliation, and that Sabine had chosen, in that instant, to protect a stranger rather than expose her. I admitted my part without flinching, and without performing shame I didn't actually feel. Then I produced the documentation, dated contracts, signed proposals, the original event brief, proving my work on the coastal reopening had been commissioned months before any fake relationship existed. Audrey, cornered by her own messages now circulating in full context rather than Celia's selective crop, went pale and silent in a way I found I no longer needed to enjoy. One of the older board members, a soft-spoken man named Whitfield, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire evening, finally raised his hand and asked, mildly, whether Ms. Ward could clarify exactly how she had obtained private message screenshots belonging to a woman who was not even a Laurent House employee. Celia's composure, so carefully maintained through the whole campaign, faltered for the first time all night. "I was protecting the company's interests," Celia said. "By breaching someone's privacy," Whitfield said, "and misrepresenting the timeline of a legitimate contract." That's not protecting our interests, Ms. Ward. That's a liability we'll be discussing separately. Around the room, I watched allegiances shift in real time. Board members who'd been quietly courted by Celia over the past weeks, suddenly recalculating, unwilling to have their names attached to whatever came next. It wasn't a single dramatic verdict. It was a slow, grinding realization spreading table to table, the specific sound of a plan collapsing under the weight of its own dishonesty, rather than anyone's raw power. Celia's carefully built case dissolved not because Sabine was powerful, but because Celia had been caught manipulating evidence, and even her own allies on the board weren't willing to be associated with that. When the room quieted, Sabine stepped forward. She didn't give a long speech. She rarely did. The story that circulated about June and me began with a lie, she said, her voice carrying without needing to rise. She said my name to protect herself from public cruelty, and I let her, because I recognized what she was standing in. That part was false. She looked at me, and every guarded thing I'd ever seen in her face was simply gone. Everything after it became increasingly real, and I let it, because I wanted it to be. She turned back to the room, steady. June owes this company, and she owes me, absolutely nothing. She's free to walk away tonight and keep every bit of the reputation she built before she ever knew my name. Her eyes found mine again. The lie was that she arrived as my girlfriend. The truth is that, somewhere along the way, I began hoping she would choose to become one. She didn't move toward me. She'd learned that much, at least, that this last part could not be another performance she staged. So I crossed the room myself. I took her face in my hands in front of the cameras, the board, the reporters, Audrey's stricken expression, all of it rendered suddenly and completely irrelevant. I'm tired of being loved like a secret, I told her. I don't want a secret, Sabine said, and kissed me before I could say anything else, her hands coming up to frame my face the way mine had framed hers, and for one long, unhurried moment, neither of us heard the room at all. Not the murmurs, not the shutters clicking, not Celia's furious retreat toward the exit. Just the ocean, somewhere beyond the glass, and each other. 6 months later, my studio had expanded into the space next door. Not because Sabine had bought it for me, which I would have refused, but because the reopening had brought in more work than I could handle alone, and I'd finally hired a second designer to help carry it. I still challenged Sabine over impractical timelines and unrealistic vendor budgets, and she still, occasionally, pretended to be irritated about it before doing exactly what I'd suggested. She had gotten better, slowly, at telling me when something frightened her, instead of retreating into silence and calling it control. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, which was the only thing I'd ever actually asked for. Audrey's engagement to Celia quietly dissolved a few months after the reopening, though I only learned about it secondhand, from Mila, who heard it from someone at the bakery who apparently heard everything eventually. I felt, when she told me, a flicker of something I expected to be satisfaction, and turned out instead to be simple, uncomplicated relief. The specific relief of realizing an old wound had finally, fully closed, with nothing left inside it demanding my attention. Celia resigned from the board 2 months after that, quietly, with a statement about pursuing other opportunities that fooled absolutely no one who'd been in that reopening ballroom. Prescott, of all people, sent me a fruit basket the following spring, with a note thanking me for making him, in his words, considerably less terrible at his job. I kept the note pinned to my studio corkboard, next to the swatch of ivory silk from the night everything started. I kept a drawer at her place, and half my wardrobe had somehow migrated there over the months, though my studio and my name stayed entirely my own. We went to events now without staging anything at all, and every so often, in the middle of some room full of people who mattered, Sabine's hand would settle at my waist without her seeming to notice she'd done it, and I would lean over and tease her about the gesture that had started this entire impossible, wonderful mess, and she would look at me with that rare, private, almost smile that still, after everything, felt like something she'd decided to give only to me. She brought me back to the Coastal Hotel's greenhouse on a quiet evening in early spring, the space restored properly now, the same climbing flowers grown thick and healthy along the old iron frame, candlelight caught in glass panes that no longer held anything but good memories. She'd kept part of the reopening design permanently, she told me, turned the whole space into a private garden rather than an event venue, something that belonged to no one's business calendar. She didn't propose. She'd told me once that felt too fast, too much like another performance, and I'd agreed. Instead, she handed me a small brass key, warm from her palm, and asked whether I'd help her decide what to actually do with the rest of the house it opened. Not stage it, not curate it for anyone watching, just build it, slowly, the way real things get built. I've never let anyone choose anything in that house, she admitted, turning the key over once in my palm, before letting go of it entirely. Not the paint, not the furniture, nothing. It stayed exactly as my grandmother left it, because changing it felt like erasing her, and eventually that turned into a rule I never questioned. And now? Now I'd like it to feel like it belongs to someone who's actually living in it, she said. Both of us. I closed my hand around the key, still warm, and thought about a ballroom full of candles and a lie that had started this whole impossible chain of events, and how little that terrified woman from 6 months ago could have imagined standing here now. I understood, standing there under glass and starlight with her hand finding mine the way it always did now, without asking, without performing, that she wasn't offering me a hidden room in her life. She was asking me to help make the life itself. Once, I had borrowed her name to keep from looking unwanted in front of a room full of people who'd already decided who I was. Now she chose me, plainly, with no audience left to convince, no lie left to maintain, nothing between us but the quiet, ordinary, entirely real fact of two women who had stopped performing love and simply, finally, found it.